Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching The Salty Sea, and today I am finally making the video that I have been putting off for at least 8 months. People have been calling Warcry dead for much longer than 8 months, but that's about how long that the conversation has been at a sort of low background hum at all times. And finally, I feel like I need to at least address the elephant in the room. What was kind of the catalyst for this was Tabletop Minions doing a video that I don't think was necessarily intentioned in a horrible way, but that came off as somewhat sensationalist and cruel about the end of Warcry. And people who aren't really in the Warcry community have been making these types of videos about Warcry for ages. But what I think struck me with this one is that Uncle Adam has always been somewhat of a fan of Warcry. As a video, it felt like this kind of dead game conversation really reaching a fever pitch. He just starts the video by talking about the game in the past tense. He has an incredibly sensationalist thumbnail, and there are ideas in here that I think are worth talking about. Like, is GW's approach to fantasy just over the last 2 decades just not hitting with people, regardless of whether they're doing it well? Mordheim factors into these dead game conversations as well. And one of the things he does bring up here is that Mordheim is not a very good replacement for Warcry because it's just not a modern game. It's really meant for scratch builders who skew really old. The only scratch building gamer that I know who loves to scratch build stuff for every single game is actually like 12 years old, but everyone else is generally, very aged who's into that. So there's a lot here that really disappointed me, I guess, because you could have talked about this in a way that wasn't meant to prey on the angst of a really already kind of angsty fan base and community. And this is just kind of something we keep seeing. So it's at this point something that I can't not talk about. People asking if the game is dead is just kind of a constant topic on the Warcry Reddit. And people complaining about how many people ask whether or not the game is dead is a constant topic on the Warcry Discord. This is just a topic that even if you don't think the game is dead, or even if there are very few people, but there are some people who think that the game is the healthiest it's ever been, even if you think that, this is the conversation that ends up tinging all of these online chatter conversations, which I really hate and is why I haven't done a video, despite this being the dominant conversation around the game for the last 8 months. But at this point, it's just so hard to ignore because it is such a high percentage of what is being talked about. And so I think that we can kind of separate a few different pieces of the conversation, right? And sort of what's excusable to me and what's kind of bad faith opportunism. Because something that I see a lot of, especially on the Reddit, sometimes on the Discord, is someone who clearly loves Warcry, who is just kind of in their feelings a little bit, and they're posting in despair. And sometimes people who obviously love this game, maybe even to an unhealthy amount, will post in despair that the game is dead or the game is dying. Whether it's because they're frustrated at the lack of support, whether they're frustrated at how hard it is to get a game in their local scene. And I'm very sympathetic towards those people, honestly. People, there's a few different kinds of complainers, but one constant type of complainer in every situation, in every fandom, is the person who's complaining a lot because they love something. And if you are just really frustrated at how hard it is to find people to play with you with this game, I don't know what to tell you, man. It's really hard. Like, I want to feel for you. I want to tell you that your frustrations are valid. Posting online about saying that the game is dead or dying is not very helpful to anyone else, but it's really hard for me to be mad at you for having done it because, you're feeling something and your feelings are valid. The thing that really does piss me off, though, is the general wargamers who are just kind of looking for a provocative subject. And Warcry has always been kind of the perfect size game to declare dead. People have occasionally declared Warcry dead ever since first edition. And the reason is because it's a game that GW has pushed enough that every general wargamer has heard of Warcry. They've seen it on shelves. It has a very small place on shelves, but they see it. So they've all heard of it. But war crabs, war criers, we don't hang out in general wargaming spaces. You don't see us on r/Warhammer. You don't see us posting on the biggest content creators' YouTube channel comments about Warcry. You don't see us necessarily setting up our events in the same tournament halls as other games, right? And so a lot of general wargamers think that no one plays Warcry because they don't know anyone who plays Warcry, because we are a pretty different community. A lot of the people who I have played Warcry with in Minnesota are folks who aren't that into other Warhammer games, because it's a niche product and it attracts a different type of person than who generally likes stuff like 40K. And so the general wargamer will often just not know any Warcry players. And so it's really easy for them to react to someone saying Warcry is dead and being like, oh yeah, it must totally be dead. I don't know anyone who plays this game. And then they will kind of support that conversation and allow that conversation to cascade. And so it becomes this really perfect, like Schrodinger's game for any kind of general wargaming content creator, where you can say something sort of bold and sensationalist, like this game is dead, and a lot of the people in your immediate circle won't contradict you, won't tell you that, hey man, that's just not a very educated take. Or like, that's like super embarrassing for you that you would say that. Nobody is really telling them that right away, because they're not bothering to do research. They're not bothering to find out where the Warcry community is. I mean, Uncle Adam is a really big deal in the general wargaming community, and I don't think, and he posts about Warcry every once in a while, and I don't think I've ever spoken to someone who has spoken to him. Right? Because he just isn't interested in sort of finding out who the Warcry community is, because his community is his community. And so if nobody there is playing Warcry, then the game must be dead, right? We can have real sober conversations about the health of the game, and I plan to do that during this video. But at the end of the day, those are very different conversations than what the average content creator talking about Warcry is having, because what they're doing is boosting their own channel by talking about a game that they're not particularly interested in actually learning about. I don't think that all of these conversations are in bad faith. I completely take Adam at his word that he likes Warcry as a game. It's just that sometimes you don't know what you don't know. For example, I know that I don't know anything about the digestive systems of deep sea invertebrates, right? I don't need to ever make a video talking about them, because I know that I know nothing about that subject. But I do know just enough about Kill Team to say something dangerously wrong, because I might say something that's wrong that I just think is correct, because I actually do know the game at least fairly well. I've played the game a few times. And so I'm like right in that spot where I don't know what I don't know about Kill Team. And so I think that might be the kindest reading that I can give of the situation. And so to that end, I think it's worth talking about the health of the game, and the kind of the state of the game, because there's a few things going on with Warcry right now that I think we can talk about. For example, we can talk about the fact that narrative play in Warcry at the moment is in a really difficult spot. The narrative campaign structure had a lot of promise right away, right at the bat of Warcry. I made a breathlessly hyped video 2.5 years ago about how promising I thought that the Warcry campaign structure was. And that was before, about maybe 7-8 months into the second edition, we started to find out that the replayability of Warcry's narrative structure was really, really low. The balance items are a mess. Casual players are affected by balance just as much as competitive players are. When your items are just like having vastly different effects on the game, that can make the game less fun. Encampments, you get your first encampment and then you lose your encampment and you realize you wasted a lot of energy and time thinking about encampments, and they're just not fun. And it's like they have a massive effect on the game and they aren't fun, which is just a real problem. Mini quests are really fun at first because you get to kind of make this character build like you're playing Baldur's Gate or Diablo. But then as the campaign progresses, bouncing from mini quest to mini quest to mini quest actually starts to feel really sterile. There's no kind of shared goal amongst the different players. Something that I think that is very excellent about the latest Path to Glory book in AOS is that there is kind of a shared buildup for all of the players, even as everyone is improving their army in vastly different ways. So, these issues with the Warcry campaign made it so that your second campaign just isn't nearly as fun as your first one. And so it becomes important for you as a player or as sort of a small community playing campaigns to try to inject your own replayability into the system. You have to start being a home brewer in order to do it. And so that's a reason why a lot of narrative events are still really excellent in Warcry. I would say Warcry is the perfect system to hold a narrative event for. But that's because TOs, bless their hearts, and I've done this a few times, are putting incredible amount of work into making a 4-game mini campaign for everyone in the narrative event to do. And Warcry is the perfect system for that, but it's not a very sustainable state of affairs, if we're being honest with narrative play. Asking your local, tournament host to put, 20 to 30 hours of work into creating a campaign pack that can compel 20 players for a day's playing is not something that's going to work other than just like maybe once or twice a year or at conventions. Because it's too much work for the average person to take on all of the time. Narrative tournaments require a lot more work than competitive tournaments do in order to pop off, and the audience is smaller. So it's just a very difficult set of circumstances. And the fact that Warcry hasn't put together a really good narrative tournament pack structure is a real problem because, you don't want to just do the regular campaign for your narrative events because that thing's borked, and everyone who has played a bunch of campaigns knows that it's borked and unfun, and it doesn't really pop off in just 4 games anyway. So this is all to say that I do think that the state of narrative play in Warcry is in an unhealthy place, and that is something that we can be very honest about, while at the same time being honest about the fact that the competitive scene is actually in a really good place generally. I think right now we're maybe in a bit of an ebb for that because we're waiting for an FAQ that is probably going to come. I think, for people who are saying the game is dead, I do think we've had 3 FAQs. One was 6 months after the new edition. Then they waited about 15 months before the next one. But Johnny Bracken said they're planning on continuing to do them every 6 months, and there's no reason not to take him at his word at this point. I think that even if you're just saying that the game is just in maintenance mode, as far as, maybe no new stuff, you can't deny that 6 months, an FAQ every 6 months is going to just keep this competitive scene playable for a long time. And something that has worked so well for Warcry is that it has very clean mechanics and it has very deep list building. And those are 2 ingredients for excellent competitive play. There are things where sometimes the point algorithm can be exploited to a point where you'll get a dead end on a certain mission pack. That has often happened, and I think it's happening with the mission packs that are kind of out there and popular right now. Angry Gnarlwood, or whatever it's called, which sort of favors kind of the same things over and over and over, and I think we're starting to solve that pack under the current points algorithm. But an FAQ doesn't have to do a lot of work to completely revitalize that and completely change that. And I am going to be doing a video pretty soon about some other community competitive battle packs that are out there that I think have kind of solved all of the issues with the current one that GW has put out. So that's to say that there is just a lot going on, and the number of players playing is certainly lower than it was. I would say the peak of second edition Warcry's popularity happened between February and April of 2024. And, that was a year ago. And there's certainly fewer players now than there were then, but not by so much that you would say that the game is dead, right? If the game is 15% smaller than it was at the height of its popularity, that's just kind of normal ebb and flow through editions, right? That's kind of the normal ebb and flow of a game. And so I would say that competitive play in Warcry is still in a pretty healthy place. And so anyone kind of going around saying the game is dead really needs to go and try to purposefully ignore this fact if they want to say that, because the game is in a pretty happy place here. Now, we are talking small numbers, right? Kill Team, puts probably 5 times as many tournaments out. There's probably 5 times as many people playing competitive Kill Team as there are Warcry. I would say AOS has roughly 9 times as many people competitively playing the game as Warcry does. And so those are much bigger numbers. But at the same time, any indie game would kill to have the tournament numbers and tournament attendance that Warcry currently has. Even if in its currently quote-unquote dead state, Warcry is still putting together more people playing tournaments than play even the biggest indie games for the most part. And so those are real numbers, and that is a real competitive scene. And that is something that is part of the game. I don't know. I'm starting to repeat myself here, but you get what I mean. Competitive Warcry is very much not dead. The last thing that I think is really interesting with Warcry is that it continues to be a homebrewer's paradise. The culture of homebrewing in Warcry started really with mission design. We can thank James for just being so bad at designing missions for this incredible game. The cards are the cards that come with the game, where you do a random win condition, a random map, and a random set of deployments, make for this really interesting situation where about a third of your games are unplayable. A third of your games are really cool for the first time playing it, but you really wouldn't want to play it again. And then a third of your missions are just really good. The problem with that is it's a really awkward situation for competitive play. It doesn't make for very compelling tournaments. And so when you just make static missions for tournaments, it took Games Workshop a long time to figure out what actually made a compelling matched play mission. And so the community had to do it for them. And I still don't think Games Workshop has done that well. I think there are maybe 3, maybe 4 missions that Games Workshop has done that have stood the test of time. It's really not very many, and they've put out a lot of them, and they're all bad. But the community fixed that and is continuing to fix it and iterate and make even better missions over and over and over. I promise I will be putting out a video soon about some really incredible homebrew stuff that the community has done in this space. But I think now we are looking at a place where there's a lot of ammo out there and a lot of opportunity out there for people to put together their own homebrews of different things. Whether it's, I talked about the tragedy of narrative play. I'm going to be trying to make a 6-game campaign that can be something that's maybe just a little bit bigger than one-day tournament, but something that you could edit down to a one-day tournament as well, because I want to be able to do like a local narrative league, right? And so for a league, you are going to do more than just 4 games. but you don't want it to last forever. And so that's why I'm hoping that a 6-game campaign will be a really nice little midpoint, a really nice little stopping point there, right? But you can make all kinds of different homebrews like that. You can build a new faction. You can make a new mechanic and see how it overlays, a new battle pack. All of this is really doable because the game's mechanics are so simple and so easy flowing that putting one more layer of rules onto them is, I think, really clean and really easy to do. And so I think that any discussion about the health of Warcry or the the dead or not dead Schrodinger aspect of Warcry is something that has to include the fact that I think that Warcry is going to have, even if we never get a new edition, I think that Warcry will have very long legs as a homebrewer type of game, as something that you could say, treat it like an RPG, right? Where it's like we're using the bones of Warcry to create this new homebrew thing. I would even be interested in playing someone's, one-off rule book that they've made, even if they're just really explicit, or you can't be too explicit because Games Workshop will sue the crap out of you. But even if someone is sort of implying that they're just like, hey, I took Warcry and I added 2 rules, and here's my game, and here's how it's going to play out, and here's how to use those 2 rules to play something, right? I would absolutely play that game, and I think that Warcry is going to have really long legs for that reason. And it's going to be something that's really easy for the community to keep alive. I think that Warcry has a future of being a better minis agnostic casual game than most of the minis agnostic casual indie games out there. That doesn't mean that I don't like indie games. I am a pro indie game person, but it just means that Warcry sets a high bar. And so it's something that I think, well, it's both a high bar and a good set of stepping stones to getting to a high bar, because you can use very little about Warcry is copyrightable, and so you could use it to create your own game really easily. And I hope that this game lives for decades in that format. Even if we never get a new edition, I hope this game lives for decades as a sort of structure of games. And by the way, I've been playing a lot of indie games. Ooh, maybe I have a slide on this later. No, I don't. I've been playing a lot of indie games that are so much better than they could have been 5 years ago, because I legitimately think that Warcry is, I probably can't make the argument that it's the most influential game of the last decade, but it is incredibly influential. Having played a bunch of indie games recently, I can tell you that Warcry looms large in that scene. And so that's cool, right? This game is not dead because it lives on in so many indie games. This game will never die because it lives on in so many good indie games. And so I think there will always be people who want to go back to the original formula because this game is so good. I think Warcry 2nd Edition will kind of stand the test of time that way, even if it never gets a 3rd. And by the way, I do think it will get a 3rd. It's just clearly been bumped and is not going to happen this year. Whether it comes next year or the year after, I don't know. Or if it never comes, I don't know. But I will say we're not getting it this year. Hopefully we can just make that a thing that's not the main thing that we comment about. But hey, if you want to comment about that, feel free to leave a comment in the below in the video. Let's talk about, I think, the primary reason why people feel this game is in an unhealthy place. And I know, again, a lot of people do think the game is in a healthy place. And I just talked about how the homebrewing and the competitive scene are both very healthy right now. But the main problem with Games Workshop's sort of support of Warcry is there's just this lack of support, where they have supported the game in ways that people didn't want. Nobody wanted 4 boxes of slightly different meat trees. Everyone hated those. And they have failed to support the game in ways that people do want. And the biggest way of that is the fact that the latest warbands, the last 4 warbands they put out, were just such nothing burgers that they didn't add anything to the community. And so it made it feel like there was nothing new happening in the game, even when there was, because none of those 4 boxes made any dent on the meta, in a way that when a warband that is new does affect the meta, it is incredibly exciting. I don't like Wildercore hunters, but you can't deny that they are exciting. You can't deny that the release that had Wildercore and Cruel Boys Monster Killers and Vulcan Flameseekers, that made Warcry exciting for 6 months as people figured out what effect those warbands had both on their own excitement to play Warcry and on the meta as a whole. It was an incredible shot in the arm. And so if, say, Twistweld had been an interesting warband, it came out 10 months ago, right? If Twistweld and Tyrannic Cohort had been cool, that would have been the primary Warcry conversation for 6 months. And so it would only really have been like this last January and February that people would have started, looking at their watch and going, TikTok, when's something going to happen, right? So that was really, I think, a big part of why people keep trying to call Warcry dead even when it's not, is because of just those last 4 warbands being so bad. Now, we also just have this issue where there have been no new models since the Twistweld, and that's why it's just so glaring that they aren't pulling their part of the bargain, because there's nothing else to take it up. And for me personally, I don't really care about this. Every new AOS model is eventually a Warcry model. I still have a lot of faith that FAQs are going to continue to add new AOS models into Warcry. The last FAQ had incredibly well-designed concepts for Dark Oath and for the new Skaven stuff and for the new Stormcast stuff. And if that keeps coming, I don't give a shit if there are new Warcry models, even though I understand that from a hype perspective, from a new player perspective, we need them. As far as a health of the game perspective, I think it's okay. And the last thing that is a real problem is the fact that the starter set is unusable. Crypt of Blood is unplayable as a self-contained board game. It's fine, but as a way to become a Warcry player, it doesn't give you a single warband. Both halves are totally playable if you buy another battle line. So if you buy these new Barrow Guard, then you have 3 pretty reasonable heroes and just a bunch of Graveguard in your Warcry game if you have Crypt of Blood, right? You can do that, but it's just not it's not a starter set if you have to buy 2 more boxes to actually start the game with it. So that part's really a shame. There hasn't been a good way to start the game since Nightmare Quest all the way back in 2023, which again makes new player acquisition just really, really hard. And that part is too bad. And that brings me to something that is somewhat of a painful conversation, which is kind of copium in the community. I hope that we can be honest and sober about how much that lack of support, how much being hamstrung by multiple different bad GW decisions has hurt us. Because getting new players into Warcry right now is really difficult. We can be honest about that. Both due to the lack of hype, because no new models. Also, we have a real skill gulf. If you don't know about the channel Distraction Makers, they're very much a worthwhile listen. They put out a video a little while ago that was called The Paradox of Skill. They've since kind of addendumed it to be like, this is the paradox of skill testing. There's something else that is the paradox of skill. But essentially, the problem that Warcry is facing right now is that players are too good. If you don't put a ton of research into learning the game, if you just go, here's the models I own, I'm going to rock up to this event and see what Warcry is like. There are very few places in the world where you can do that and have a good time. I think a lot of UK people will interpret this the wrong way, but the UK is still a place where a new player can roll up with just some models they own and maybe still win a couple games, still maybe go 2-2 at a tournament, because I think most of the UK community has sort of all chosen to decelerate how competitive they are going to be. And so you'll see much less competitive list building for the average player in one of those tournaments. And I think that that is part of why the UK is still seeing roughly the same numbers at tournaments that they saw a year ago. But for most of the community, people are just too willing to play what's good and too and honestly just too skilled at the game, right? You are just not going to be able to bring one box of a warband and win even one game at a lot of those tournaments. And so you need to do real research if you want to join the Warcry competitive scene. So you kind of have to be a bit spiky with how you play. And listen, the guy, Adepticon just happened, and one of the two people who 4-0'd, this was his first tournament, right? But he did a ton of research. I was talking with him. Shouts to you, Chad. You are incredible. Chad did a ton of research on like the different ways to play Ruination Chamber, how to approach the game, where the meta was at. He did hours and hours of research before he showed up to his first game. So even though he was new, he had done the work to cross the skill gap that exists between the average player and a new player. But for most new players, Warcry tournaments are just really hard to join right now. And you can overcome that as game designers. You cannot overcome that as a gaming community. You can't just ask people to lose on purpose. That approach just isn't sustainable for most communities. Most communities are not going to be able to do that. And so that's where you need game designers to help you. You need things like shakeups. You need new factions that are potentially really good against what is currently really good, even though they have other weaknesses. And so people have to rethink how they play against those. That's something that I think Monster Killers did really well, where they were just really good against certain types of foot slogging warbands. And the only real way to go toe-to-toe with Monster Killers is either to shoot them or to be fast, right? That was a really incredible meta shakeup that they gave us. You need things like that to make the really good players have to rethink how they play the game, which allows the not as good players to catch up, because the new players, all the really good players are temporarily not good anymore. And so now no one's good. And so the new players can use that time to catch up. That's tough because we're not going to get that anymore. And so that is something that the community needs to be aware of. And that is where it puts a lot of pressure on these FAQs. And so there is a real question: how long will these every 6-month FAQs continue to hold interest? Because we are not getting any new factions, any new releases to shake things up, to make the best players not be the best players anymore. We do need these FAQs to all be really good. We need them to not only be sort of trimming down the best things in the game, but we need them to be essentially making new factions by taking the crappiest factions and giving them new life in order to create this shakeup that hamstrings the best players in the game enough to make new player acquisition more possible. A few scenes are still going strong, but for them to stay strong, that is going to be necessary. And so this is something where there's a lot of pressure there. And for us in the community, I am very, very sympathetic to people who are nervous about that, who are nervous about whether that will continue. And there's not much I can really say other than just wait and see and hope that the FAQs are really good. Because if they are really good, I think that the competitive scene is just going to keep staying healthy. And yeah, it's going to be hard to grow, especially in the communities that don't have regular events. It's going to be really hard to grow an event out of nothing. But I do think if the FAQs are good, I think that we can reasonably hope that the communities that are currently playing a lot of Warcry will continue to stay strong. And even those communities could grow a little bit as just like word gets out locally that the events are just really good. One other thing that I do think is a bit of an issue as far as something that we tell ourselves in the community that isn't necessarily true is that Warcry doesn't need a rules update because the rules are perfect. And the rules are really excellent. Warcry is really fun. But something that I've noticed while playing a lot of indie games, I kind of alluded to this before when I say that Warcry looms incredibly large in the indie game community, is that because of that, Warcry's greatest strengths are not quite as unique as they used to be anymore. Warcry plays incredibly smoothly, and it has incredible list building freedom and incredible list building. Like, it's easy to do, but it's very complex. Whereas the trade-offs you're making when you build lists are very complex and not always obvious right away, which is the sign of a really good system. The thing is that a lot of indie games are starting to do a decent job at this. Now, they're indie, so they will never be really big. But Warcry's sort of stranglehold as like, this is the best, cleanest system that you can possibly have for a skirmish game. I do think that is starting to slip a little bit. And I think that, a new addition to give Warcry some oomph there would be really nice. We're not getting it. So that's, again, where homebrewing comes in. I do think that seeing good homebrew is the way to sort of continue Warcry's edge there among other games. There is a question, though, of whether this lack of support and whether, the things that are real weaknesses in Warcry right now, whether they should even matter. Because I kind of don't think they should. Warcry is awesome, and if you and your friends are having a good time with it, keep playing it. GW can't stop you playing a game you like just because they're not giving you any new models anymore. You can kit bash any new release of models to be a Warcry warband. There's so many different vibes, so many different factions, that I don't think there's a single model line for any fantasy competing game that you can't legitimately say this should count as Warcry faction X. So there's just like no situation where GW can really stop you and your friends from playing it. And so if you're still having fun, I don't know that the support level really matters. Now the question is, are you someone who is frustrated by the lack of support in and of itself? I do sometimes feel like Games Workshop doesn't want me to play Warcry, and while that shouldn't matter, it can be annoying that they're not giving me new things to chew on, new things to play around with. I sometime last like February or so really started feeling like the walls were closing in as far as I kind of knew what was good and was starting to be much more interested in purposefully playing things that kind of sucked because I just wasn't being surprised by the outcomes of competitive games anymore. I have been surprised at how games have played out between other people, but the games that I've played, it's generally played out broad strokes the way I thought it would, even though, I still lose sometimes due to a blunder or weird dice, or not even weird dice, but just bad dice or good dice by my opponent. And those are all normal reasons to lose games. But sometimes even when you lose, like the loss doesn't surprise you. I really love when I lose a game that I was surprised how I lost it, or when I win a game and either me or my opponent is surprised by how I won it. Like I saw a line of play somewhere midway through round 3 that I didn't realize my warband was capable of achieving, and I won because of that. Those are really exciting. That's like some of the best feelings you can have in gaming. And there is a situation, or there is a point at which if there's not a lot of support, those feelings can be rarer and rarer. And I do think that good FAQs can make sure that you keep having this. I think the last FAQ was maybe not the best, other than the amazing, it was amazing at giving us 2 new factions, but it wasn't the best as far as tweaking the existing factions for competitive play, right? So if you're in that situation, if you're feeling the walls closing in, you're not like a bad patriot if you play a different game. Please don't let the game is meant to serve you. You are not meant to serve the game. So if you do take a break from Warcry until the next FAQ, I'm not blaming you for that. That's a reasonable thing for you to do. Think of it this way. Did you make gaming friends while playing Warcry, while having this game as a part of your life? If you did, play whatever game with those new Warcry friends. Play whatever game you want with them. There's always going to be a door to come back to Warcry from whatever game you decide to play, because Warcry is fun. But the important thing is the gathering. The important thing is the friends that you made playing the game. And if if your community that you built through Warcry is still playing together, then Warcry's not dead. Warcry's alive. You guys can always just play it together. And just because you are playing God tier today, or just because you're playing, I don't know, Necropolis 28 today or Kill Team today, that doesn't mean you're not a Warcry play group. You all know how to play Warcry. You all met through Warcry and you all play together. That's great. That's not a dead game, right? You'll just keep coming back to it every now and then, and you'll play other things every now and then, and that's fine. You don't have to be loyal to a game. A game should be loyal to you. So hopefully that's something I can leave you with. The health of the game is what it is. I think it's really good at some things, and I'm never going to stop playing Warcry. But, we can also be honest about the places that we're coping and the places where the game could use some help, and that's okay. We're getting these FAQs. I assume we'll be getting an FAQ in the next 3 weeks or so, just because that would be in line with every 6 months. And when we do, I've got a lot of content planned for evaluating it, evaluating how it affects the meta, etc. And that's going to be really exciting. And in the meantime, you can homebrew narrative and have a great time. So when you do it, may all your rolls be crits.